So another year, a whole bunch of data breaches. We set an all-time high in 2023. And the big question, of course, is, did we tie it, beat it, do we fall under it? But before that, for those of you who are not sure who the ITRC is, maybe this is the first time that you're encountering us. This is our 25th year. We have been in the business of supporting, free of charge, consumers who are the victims of identity crimes. And since 2005, so this is our 20th anniversary, we have also been tracking data breaches and other identity trends. We have the largest repository of information on data breaches in the United States. So if you need to know anything about what's going on in the data breach world, we're your organization. So what did happen in 2024? The total number of compromises, as to quote Maxwell Smart, would you believe Chief missed it by that much? We were 44 breaches short of tying last year's all-time high. So we did not quite get there. But when you look at it in terms of the number of breach notices issued, we were off the charts. So you saw an in excess of 300% increase in the number of notices. Now that is not a one-to-one correlation to human beings. There are not 1.7 or 1.6 billion people in the United States. So what does that tell us? A lot of people got more than one data breach notice. When you break that out into the various ways breach notices are generated or compromises occur, cyber attacks, far and away the largest category. Of the 3158, 2552 were related to some form of a cyber attack, and we'll go through those categories here in just a second. That accounts for 1.6 billion of the 1.7 billion notices that were distributed last year. System and human errors come way down from the 2,500. Now we're a little over 300. And as we'll see in a minute, there's one category that stands out among those, but system and human errors do occur, but they're basically flat. There's one area that's a kind of lumpy, but they're basically flat. Physical attacks continue to decline. We still see them. There's one category that kind of jumps out, but you're talking about 33 different kind of notices that were tied to some form of physical attack. Supply chain attacks get folded up into all three of those categories, but it is worth pointing out because that is an area of growth in some respects for cyber criminals. We did see fewer, in terms of raw numbers, fewer supply chain attacks, but the impact of those supply chain attacks were magnified because they were geared toward very, very large supply chains. Think Change Healthcare, for example, where we still don't know how many organizations were actually involved in the supply chain that was compromised in that particular attack. So we did say breach notices are a big issue for now. Well, since 2021, we have seen the decline in the amount of information contained in data breach notices. So 65% did not have any attack vector information. Now that's across all three of those. If we were to break this out and just look at cyber attacks, which we're going to do in a minute, that number would be 70%. So 70% do not have information, and for the math challenged, 30% do. So less than a third of all data breach notices related to a cyber attack actually tell you about the cyber attack. Prior to 2021, 100% of data breach notices had that information. So we're going to talk about that in a second. We're flying blind in many respects about what actually is occurring and the actual impacts. Let's look at from a size perspective. No surprise here. If you've been reading the newspaper, do people still read newspapers, by the way? If you've been reading online, you're undoubtedly aware about the Ticketmaster, probably maybe the Advanced Auto Parts and AT&T. Those were all related to Snowflake and the Snowflake supply chain. And then you also have Change Healthcare in there. So all of these are what we're referring to as mega breaches, 100 million plus. There's one other 100 million plus data breach involved in the top 10, and then you fall off dramatically from there. From a, that's just one more point on that one, and that is of those top 5 right there, 4 of them have direct correlation to some form of stolen credential. So we're going to talk about what that means here in a second. But when you look at it from an industry perspective, financial services for the first time in 6 years comes out on top. Yay, financial services, I guess. Within that, it's actually commercial banks and insurance that is driving the number of attacks that has now put financial services back in the top spot where they were for many, many years. Healthcare drops down because healthcare has been, for a wide variety of reasons. It's not that they're any less targeted, it's that their efforts to secure the supply chain and their efforts to reduce the number of breaches is actually paying off in many respects. Okay, let's look at the general trends. So here again, total compromises over time. Now I picked 2018 for a reason, because that's the first time that all 50 states, the territories, and the District of Columbia had an operating data breach notice law. Alabama and North Dakota passed their law in 2018. They were the last 2 holdouts. So now, for the first time, from 2018 forward, we have an apples to apples comparison. Prior to that, there was a mishmash of a number of states. So we can see the trend. Notice it's lumpy a little bit. We'll go up a year and we'll fall back the next year. We go up a year, we'll fall back a little bit the next year. We'll go up a year and we fall back a little bit. All of those are correlated to major improvements by the bad guys in their tactics and techniques. So the big jump from 22 to 23 was in 22, you had the development of the low-cost breach kits that the bad guys use to infiltrate organizations. So the follow-on year, you see the big jump. And now this year, we're down a little bit. What's happening this year is the recruiting of pen testers by organized criminal groups. So we can expect to see in follow-on years increased breaches as a result of their efforts to find more vulnerabilities in software. So let's look at the attack vectors. This is in cyber attacks. Sorry for the fact that this is an eye chart. You can see the trend line up from 2019 up to 2024, increasing every year. So cyber attacks are far and away the number 1 cause of a data breach notice. But within that, a lot of things are static, right? The kind of trend line. What is not is that bottom line. That's where we don't know what's happening. So of the 2,500 data breaches, we don't know what happened in 1,700 of them. We just know there was a data breach. That's it. And it may have been reported as a cyber attack, but no underlying attack vector. So we don't really know technically what's happening in those cases. But we do see some trends across these others. Interesting, we had a big fallback in terms of 0-day. That relates to, I believe, what we just talked about with the fact that particularly the Russian, the transnational cyber crime groups are hiring anybody and everybody they can as a pen tester to find more vulnerabilities, to find more 0 days. And they're layering in AI around that. So that's their proof of concept year was last year. So this coming year, we should see that operationalized. System and human errors. I point out the big number there is it's people attaching things to emails that shouldn't. So easily addressable. And in the physical attacks, again, we're talking about 33 attacks overall, so this is not a big number. We actually do know what all those were. They actually told us what happened in those cases, and it's a device theft. So that is something that, although in some respects is preventable, it's also at those numbers, it's something we can we can manage through as opposed to being a hair on fire moment. Notice that skimmer attacks are still there, but they're very, very low these days. So what are findings on all of this? Well, first of all, of the 1.7 billion victim notices, we could have avoided issuing most of those to the tune of about 1.2 billion notices never had to been issued if we had done certain things. The mega breaches, those 100 million plus, are actually masking in many respects what's actually going on. They kind of distract us to the shiny object, and it also confuses consumers because they don't really know what to know or what to believe around those big numbers. If it's a big number, they think, oh my God, when in fact it may not be an oh my God moment. Look, let's be honest. Data breach laws and even now the new federal regulations, they don't work. They have no impact on anything other than we now know that there were, 3158 data breach notices this year. And then we have to make an obligatory reference to AI. So if you go into the various data breaches, it says nearly 200. The actual number is 196. Okay, sue me. 196 could have been avoided if we had had MFA. 4 of those mega breaches, if there had been MFA internally or externally, or passkey, even better, those would not have occurred. That's 1.2 billion data breach notices that never would have been issued if there had been proper, basic blocking and tackling kind of cybersecurity. MFA is not a radical tool today. So that could have been avoided. Within that population of the rest of those, because that's only 4, so the other 192, if you had improved software development, if you hadn't gone into production with a known vulnerability, if you had patched that known vulnerability faster, if you had monitoring and better training, don't attach the wrong file. Don't send that file to everybody. There are tools in each of those instances that are available today. We're not talking about radical things. There are tools that will address every one of those. You can automate software development. You can automate patching. You can make that instant. You can have better monitoring. But in those cases, they did not. So if we improve basic blocking and tackling, we can reduce the number of identity crime victims. No question whatsoever. The mega breaches, which said they mask things. If you X out the mega breaches, there were only 266 million breach notices issued. That would be the lowest number since 2014. Now, that happens because the bad guys are better at targeting. They don't need generally huge data breaches to feed their machine. They're very good now about developing profiles and targeting using AI and other analytics tools. So they don't have to get the information of every adult American every year. So we would have had fewer victim notices if you X those out. But since we can't, that's an average of 6 data breach notices for every adult in the United States. We do know that the terminology confuses consumers. So the example I would use is, you may remember at one point in the year, we had a data broker, National Public Data, and the headline was 2.9 billion people were impacted by a breach at National Public Data. And then about 48 hours later, it was 2.7 billion records breached at National Public Data. Well, the consumers don't know that. They can't distinguish between people and records. And the real number was about 1.4 million when you got down to it. And even within that, the information was scraped from the internet. It was publicly available. It was based on public records for the most part anyway. So the actual impact of that breach was minimal. The risk of it was very low to any individual, but it was a hair on fire moment to consumers. We scared the bejesus out of them, and they stopped listening then for a while because they're going, well, I can't tell if it's important or not. So we have to be more precise and more careful about how we characterize these things. And these huge numbers, they can't get their mind around them. So we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about this. And as I mentioned, attackers are getting better at targeting. They're using the tools to go ahead and narrow who they have to attack to get what they need, whether that's a company or an individual. And that is only going to continue as they refine their use of AI, just as we're refining ours in theory. Okay, breach laws don't work. My favorite topic. There you have it. 70% of cyber attack breach notices had nothing about the actual cause of the cyber attack. If we go back to 2015, when President Obama was here and the administration proposed a national data breach law, a national standard, as opposed to the 50, we didn't even have 50 states at that point in 2015, but a national standard for what was PII, what had to be breached in order to trigger a breach notice, and what you had to do as a response to that, and what you had to disclose as part of that notice. As you may know, that didn't pass. Since that time, data compromises have gone up 300%. Since 2018, when we got everybody on board at the states, it's up 169%. And remember, remind yourself, the reason we have data breach notices, every state's statement of legislative intent says these two things. We're here to inform consumers so they can protect themselves and to incentivize companies to improve their cybersecurity and data protection. When you're up 300% in a decade, that's not working. So we need a better system for informing consumers, and we need a uniform way of doing so with uniform information sharing. Okay, with all that stuff, now what can we do? Because we're not going to get a national privacy law. We're not going to get a uniform data breach law. We may not even get very many state laws updated. So what can we do? We can use AI too. AI is not just for the bad guys. You can use artificial intelligence in improving your software development, in your cybersecurity, in your detection and your monitoring. All of those things that the bad guys do, we can do too. Now, it's not that that isn't going on, but it's not as obvious. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's needed. But also sometimes we need to tell the public, hey, we're doing these things to keep you safe. Because right now they don't think we are. So AI is part of that solution. Passkey. We already talked about, we know right now we could have prevented the vast majority of data breach notices last year if we had had passkey across the entire environment on a uniform basis. We already know from the research that the ITRC has done that 30% of consumers actually created at least one passkey in the first 9 months of last year. And remember, passkeys weren't available to everybody until about late first quarter. So that's a rapid adoption. So I'm very interested to find out what we'll find out when we rerun that survey in the middle of this year, how many more people have adopted it. But consumers realize it is important and it protects them and they want it. So it's incumbent on businesses and government agencies to deploy passkey as quickly as it can, because they can come as close as we've ever been to eliminating an entire class of attack vector. The last time we did that, for all the computer nerds in the room, think about it. It was the 80s when we changed the way you compiled Windows. When we blocked an entire line of attack by just re-architecting Windows a little bit, and that eliminated an entire class of attacks. That hasn't happened since, but we have a chance to do it here. And then lastly, it's becoming more important than ever to freeze your credit. One of the most recent data breaches, huge data breach, we still don't know how many people because of a variety of reasons. We're back to the data breach notices don't tell us all the things we need to know, is we're having a lot more children's identities compromised that way. So with the Power School breach of the last couple of weeks, and we don't know how many, but we do know that social security numbers, and even though everybody in this room, our social security number has been out there for years, it's worthless in an identity marketplace, but a kid's social security number is gold. And so it's important that we begin to have people also not only freeze their own credit, but freeze their children's credit. And that's, of course, a different process and takes a little bit longer. So that's 2024. It's going to be interesting to see now, do we follow the usual pattern and have an escalation this year? Or do we establish another one-year trend? We'll find out, but we'll be here to tell you next year. If anybody has any questions, do we have time, Jeremy? Yeah. Okay, so as Henry Kissinger once said, who has questions for my answers? Yes, sir.
I have a comment. I got your spin bananas tickets.
Yes.
That's all I have any choice.
Yeah. Thank you, Captain.
That was what I was saying. That's all I was doing.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there efforts to reduce minors' credit? If it's have to mail all the documents, minor, have all that mail that. Access required from March, you can't do it the same way you do it before. Oh.
Yep.
So it's a huge pain, and it's unclear how staff notice are at its credit reporting ability. So I'm finding it particularly like that.
As much as I would like to, I can't speak for the bureaus. I can tell you, if those of us who were around at the time when we first started doing credit freezes for adults, it was also a pain in the ass then too. And it took forever and you had to pay for it. It was expensive. It's all Ken's fault back there, by the way. Sorry, I couldn't resist. But now fast forward 20 years, it's automated. It takes minutes. You don't have to pay for it. You can freeze and thaw in a matter of minutes, has no impact on your credit score, all that other stuff. I don't know if they're working on a way to reduce that. I suspect demand for that service, because they don't like having to do it in an inefficient way either. I guess I am speaking for them in that respect. Yeah. So there are conversations underway, but you know how fast that happens, we'll have to see. But certainly demand will have an impact on that. Yes.
So what are the chances anytime soon that we see the financial organizations, oh, I can probably yell anyway, that we see the financial organizations and the companies that are holding this data become responsible and accountable for the impact these breaches have on consumers? Like, it seems amazing to me that someone says, oh, you're the victim of identity theft. Well, I'm not really the victim of identity theft. The bank that just gave my money away to somebody else is the victim of identity theft. So how do we start pushing that to the organization? So we have a lot of technology that you know clearly is not being used, particularly what you talked about MFA. So what can we do to start pushing that back to make these organizations accountable for managing and protecting our data?
Let's see, how much time do we have, Jeremy? I'll make the same disclaimer Jeremy often does. I'm not a lawyer, although I play one on television. But I can tell you as a policy wonk that the actual answer is it requires legislation, either at the state or federal level. Today, every breach law, except for California, is predicated on risk of harm. You issue a data breach notice if there is risk of harm to the individual for the release of that information. If you want to go into federal court, it's actual harm is the standard. You cannot sustain the claim unless there's actual harm. And we've had a recent case out of New Jersey, which was a dismissal of a multi-district litigation, where the judge said, even if there had been risk of harm, the information was so mundane as to have no impact. So we will have to change the standards by which these incidents are judged from a litigation perspective, from a regulatory perspective, before we can actually get to that point of having more financial accountability. Anybody else? Well, I will be around throughout the day if you have any other questions. There's also a panel coming up where we're going to talk about how bad the identity crimes suck. That's the actual title, and I love it. But Jeremy, I will turn the floor back to you.
Back to you,